Hey fam, so today is Romans um, 9, 9 and 10. And I tell you what, so usually, not usually, but every time I do these videos, I just read through the passage for the day and I pray about it, think about it, and meditate on it a little bit. And then I just come here live and, just kind of give my thoughts. Nothing's written out, nothing's really given a lot of thought in terms of what I'm going to say, just kind of comes out, which can be dangerous. This time is the first time that I actually went back and reread those chapters again. So I read Romans 9 and 10 twice, and have really given thought, not I guess to what I'm going to say, but just what does it mean? And at first it struck me one way, and then my second time through, I think it was just clear that I was making it more complicated than it really is or needs to be. So in Romans 9 and 10, Paul is basically saying that the Israelites were God's chosen people, but they had a hard heart and they were disobedient. So God opened up His promise to the Gentiles, is essentially what it says, but it starts with this idea and this attitude of, well, that's not fair. We're His chosen people. Why is he giving His favor to other people? So I think it's from that tone that chapters 9 and 10 are best understood. But it starts with something that is just like a knife in the heart. So Paul starts chapter 9 with saying that, you know what? In light of this concept, I being an Israelite, would wish that myself would be accursed, separated from Christ forever, for the sake of my kinsmen, for the sake of other Israelites. And that's one of the things that just really stopped me in my tracks as I was reading this and praying about it and thinking about it, is that I'm nowhere near that person. I can honestly say that in my heart, I cannot. I can honestly say that I cannot honestly say that I would be willing to spend eternity in hell separated from Christ if it meant that somebody else gets to spend eternity in heaven in an unbroken relationship with Christ. I'm just not there. And I've got so much to grow in my own heart before I get there. And so that's why there's the first few verses of chapter 9 just stops me in my tracks, and I almost can't even get to the rest of 9 and 10. But that's my big takeaway. But the chapters go on to talk about just the fact that, well, God chooses to have compassion on whom He chooses to have compassion, and He chooses to have mercy on those who He chooses to have mercy. And so, is it, so the question comes up, well, is that fair then? I mean, how can He hold me accountable to something that is His choice? And the response that Paul gives is two or maybe threefold. One is that that question approaches God from the wrong perspective. We need to be humble. And so Paul says, does the clay tell the potter, hey, why are you making, out of the same lump of clay, one vessel for honor and one vessel for dishonor? Of course not. The clay is just clay, and the potter does what he wants with the clay. And so that's the attitude of humility that we need to come up with, is what Paul says first in chapter 9. The second, in chapter 9, he says this whole concept that it's for us even to be able to see God's goodness and His mercy, because if there were not anybody that He was condemning, then those of us who He shows mercy and compassion to would have nothing to compare that against. We would never realize the extreme grace and compassion and mercy that God has had on us if we could not compare that to the opposite. But then the third thing, he says that ultimately it's for His own glory that He does this. He says that in chapter 9, comparing or using the example of how Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and that was for his glory. And then in chapter 10, he carries on with this theme and just talks about that it's faith in Jesus's righteousness that does away with the law. And that one of the verses there that just kind of struck me anew and afresh is chapter 10, verse 4. He says, "For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes." And I'd never read that before, kind of in this context, and it strikes me like that, is that Jesus was the end of the law for righteousness, right? When we think of righteousness, living these holy, righteous lives, we're thinking about kind of like these Old Testament rules where we, do all the things that we're supposed to be doing and not do the things that we're not supposed to be doing. We said Jesus is the end of the law for righteousness for those who believe in him. And it just shows that our righteousness is in Christ, that we are both positionally righteous and holy because of him, and we are called to a life of righteousness and holiness. So my thoughts from Romans 9 and 10.